Case 1. Mary Bell. In the summer of 1968, a 3-year-old boy was killed on a strip of waste ground in the north of England. His body was found that same night, hidden between 2 slabs of concrete in a derelict patch of inner-city Newcastle that the local children called the Tin Lizzie. The killer was 11 years old, and 4 days later, when his small coffin was carried out of his family home, that 11-year-old girl was standing on the street outside, watching. The detective watching her decided in that single second that he could not wait another day to bring her in. The girl's name was Mary Flora Bell. She had been born on the 26th of May 1957 in Newcastle upon Tyne, into a household that was difficult to describe in plain language. Her mother, Betty Bell, was severely and untreatedly mentally ill, with a chaotic personal life that left her unable to function as a mother for long stretches at a time. Across the first years of Mary's life, by accounts later collected by social workers and journalists, Betty had tried to give Mary away to strangers on more than one occasion, and there were people in the family who believed she had tried, more than once, to do worse than that. Her father was never definitively identified. The family lived in Scotswood, a working-class inner-city district of Newcastle that had not yet been redeveloped and was, in 1968, falling apart at the edges. Mary herself was bright. Her teachers and the social workers who interacted with her described her as intelligent, dominant, manipulative, quick. She lied with a kind of fluency that the adults around her found unsettling. By the spring of 1968, she had already been the subject of complaints from at least 3 other mothers in the neighbourhood who said Mary had attacked their young children. None of those complaints had resulted in any formal action. The local authority was overstretched, the police were under-resourced, and the idea that a 10-year-old girl could be a serious physical threat to younger children was not, in 1968, a category the system was prepared to take seriously. So Mary stayed in the neighbourhood. She stayed in school. She kept moving through the same streets and the same houses, and the smaller children in those streets kept playing within easy reach of her, the way smaller children always have. The boy who was killed was Brian Edwin Howe. He had just turned 3 years and 4 months old. He lived with his family on White House Road in Scotswood, the youngest in a working-class household. On the afternoon of the 31st of July 1968, he was playing on the street outside his home with his older sister Pat, the family dog, and the 2 local girls who had drifted into the orbit of his sister's group that summer. Those 2 girls were Mary Bell and Norma Bell, a 13-year-old neighbour, not a blood relative despite the shared surname. Brian wandered off with the 2 of them and did not come home. His mother and his older siblings searched the neighbourhood for hours. He was found at 11:10 that night, hidden on the Tin Lizzie waste ground between 2 concrete blocks under cut grass and weeds. This was not Mary's first killing. On the 25th of May 1968, one day before her 11th birthday, she had killed a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown inside a derelict house in the same neighbourhood. Martin's death had been treated initially as accidental. The pathologist could not establish a cause, and the police had no reason to look for a suspect. 2 days later, Mary and Norma broke into a local nursery and left a series of childish handwritten notes claiming responsibility for Martin's death. The police dismissed the notes as a prank. 2 days after that, the day before Martin's funeral, Mary turned up at his mother's front door and asked to be let in to see his body in his coffin. The mother sent her away. Brian Howe's killing was different. There was no ambiguity. The pathologist concluded he had been killed between 3:30 and 4:30 on that Wednesday afternoon. The cause of death was unmistakable, and within hours of the autopsy, the police had a homicide on their hands and a tight pool of children who had been on that street. Newcastle in 1968 was a city of working families and tight streets. Word of what had happened to Brian moved through Scotswood in hours. Mothers kept their younger children indoors. The Howes themselves were broken open by it. Brian had been the youngest. His mother had searched for him through the evening. The wait, and then the finding, and then the 8 hours of formal identification and pathology are the kind of hours that mark a family forever. Mary, meanwhile, had been going around the neighbourhood asking other children if they wanted to come and see a dead boy. She told a girl on her own street, by name, that there was something to look at on the waste ground. The girl declined. Another child on White House Road later told police that Mary had asked her to come and look at where Brian had been found. None of those small approaches had reached an adult in time. The case turned on Norma. 3 days after the body was found, Norma's parents brought her into Newcastle West End Police Station. To DCI James Dobson, the senior detective on the case, Norma gave an account in which she described being led by Mary to the body on the waste ground and described details only the killer could know, including the location of a razor blade hidden at the scene. Dobson believed her. From that moment, he had Mary Bell in his sights. He was waiting. He did not have to wait long. The funeral was held on the 7th of August 1968, and the procession began at the Howe family home on White House Road. More than 200 mourners came. The street outside the house had filled up, and as the pallbearers carried Brian's small coffin out through the front door of his home, DCI Dobson was watching one particular 11-year-old girl across the street. What he saw, he would later describe to the wire service United Press International in an account given to the reporter Robert Musil in 1975 and repeated in every authoritative retelling of the case ever since. Mary Bell was standing in front of the Howe's house when the coffin came out. She was visibly, openly delighted. Her face was bright. Her hands were moving against each other in a small, rubbing motion of pleasure. Dobson watched her there, in that street, on that Wednesday afternoon, with the small coffin coming out of the home of the boy she had killed. And he decided in that instant that he could not risk another day. He thought, as he would later put it to the press, that she would do it again. That same afternoon, both girls were brought to Newcastle West End Police Station, and at 8 at night, on the 7th of August 1968, Mary Bell and Norma Bell were formally charged with Brian Howe's murder. Mary's reply on being charged was that this was fine by her. Norma burst into tears. The case had, by the autumn of 1968, become a national story in Britain. The press had been calling the two girls the Tyneside child killers. Though as charges firmed up, the public name attached itself almost entirely to Mary. The trial opened at the Newcastle Assizes in Court 2 of the Moot Hall on the 5th of December 1968 before Mr. Justice Cusack. The prosecutor was Rudolph Lyons, QC. 2 psychiatrists, one for the Home Office and one for the defence, testified that Mary displayed what was then called a psychopathic disorder. Norma was presented as the simple, frightened follower who had been swept into something she did not understand. Mary was presented, by contrast, as the architect of both killings, the one with the will, the one with the impulse. Witnesses described her boasting, in the weeks between Martin Brown's death and Brian Howe's death, that she liked hurting people. A handwriting expert testified that the notes left at the nursery break-in had been written by both girls, but composed by Mary. The 2 psychiatrists who had examined her separately had reached the same finding. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for under 4 hours. Norma was acquitted. Mary was found guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, one for Martin Brown, one for Brian Howe. Mr. Justice Cusack imposed indefinite detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, warning the courtroom that without close supervision, she presented a very grave risk to other children. Mary Bell was held first at an approved school in Lancashire, then transferred to a number of secure units across the next 12 years. There were 2 escape attempts. She was the subject of intense and continuous tabloid attention from the moment of her trial onward, and by the time she was released on licence in 1980, the British press had been waiting for that release for the better part of a decade. She was released with a new identity, on conditions, into a community that did not know who she was. She has lived under court-ordered anonymity ever since. In 1998, she cooperated with the British journalist Gitta Sereni on a second book about her life, called Cries Unheard. The book caused public outrage because Mary had been paid for her cooperation. The Howe and Brown family spoke publicly against the payment. On the 21st of May 2003, the president of the family division of the British High Court, Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss, granted an injunction protecting Mary Bell and her daughter, who had been born after her release, from being identified by the press. A separate extension some years later brought her granddaughter under the same protection. Brian Howe's family campaigned, unsuccessfully, against those orders, arguing that anonymity for the killer's descendants outlasted the memory of the boy himself. The case has been argued over for decades in books, in academic literature, and in the British press. What has never been argued over is what DCI James Dobson saw in front of the Howe family home on the 7th of August 1968. A ranking detective stood on a Newcastle street and watched a child smile at a coffin, and he made the call to arrest before the day was out. It would be wrong to pretend that this was a one-off, a unique aberration produced by an extreme childhood and the inner city of a particular decade. Killers who turn up at the funerals of the people they have killed turn up across decades, across continents, and across every class of crime. They turn up because something in them needs to be there. Sometimes it is contempt. Sometimes it is to monitor what the investigation knows. Sometimes, as in the next case, it is for an audience that includes the killer's own grandmother. The next case is from a different country and a different world. The boys in this next case were not children. They were men in their 20s. The home was not a derelict slum but a mansion, and the funeral was not in a working-class district in Newcastle, but at one of America's most famous universities. What the two cases share is the moment afterward, in a private car behind tinted glass, where the killer made a remark his father's longtime secretary would carry into a courtroom for the rest of her life. Case 2. Lyle Menendez. On the night of the 20th of August 1989, two young men walked into the den of a Beverly Hills mansion and opened fire on their own parents with shotguns. The killings took less than a minute. 5 days later, 3,000 miles east, at the family's burial service in Princeton, the older of the two brothers wore a pair of shoes that did not belong to him. They belonged to the man whose coffin was being lowered into the ground. And in the limousine on the way home, he made a remark to his father's longtime personal secretary that she would later carry into a courtroom under oath, twice, 6 years apart. Joseph Lyle Menendez was born on the 10th of January 1968 in New York. By the summer of 1989, he was 21 years old. He lived at the family home at 722 North Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, California, a 6-bedroom mansion that the family had bought a year earlier with what was, by any measure, real money. He had been a tennis player at Princeton Day School in New Jersey, where the family had previously lived, and he had been enrolled at Princeton University, where his father had pushed him relentlessly to succeed. In 1987, he had been suspended from Princeton for plagiarism, a fact that would matter later. He had been working, at the time of the killings, as a kind of family-funded businessman in training, drawing money from his parents and floating loose plans for restaurants and consulting ventures. His father, by every account that survived him, found him underwhelming. He had no prior criminal convictions. To the prosecutors who would eventually put him on trial, he was the older brother, the dominant one, the architect of what came next and of what came after. To his own defense team, he was a long-term victim of his father's abuse, a young man who, alongside his 18-year-old brother Eric, had finally turned on a family system that had been hurting them since childhood. The trial would be fought along that line for years. His parents were Jose Enrique Menendez, 45, and Mary Louise Menendez, who everybody called Kitty, 47. Jose was Cuban-born and ferociously ambitious. He had clawed his way up the American entertainment industry, first at RCA Records, then at LIVE Entertainment, where he was a senior executive in the days when the home video market was being invented. He was a wealthy man by Beverly Hills standards, but a striver in the way the men who made themselves were strivers in that era. He was demanding. He was, by accounts from inside his own family, controlling. Kitty had been a teacher before she became a homemaker. By 1989, she was struggling with depression and with the long shape of an unhappy marriage. They had 2 sons. They lived in Beverly Hills. The estate was valued at $14 million. On the night of the 20th of August 1989, Jose and Kitty were sitting in the den at the back of the house, watching a James Bond film. Around 10 at night, the two brothers entered through the French doors, both carrying 12-gauge Mossberg shotguns they had bought at a sporting goods store in San Diego 2 days earlier. They opened fire. Jose was killed almost instantly. Kitty was attacked multiple times as she tried to flee, with a final wound delivered at close range. The brothers gathered up the spent shell casings, drove out to Mulholland Drive, threw the weapons into a canyon, and then Lyle drove back to the house and placed a staged 911 call, sobbing that he had come home and found his parents dead. Police arriving at 722 North Elm Drive that night did not initially treat the brothers as suspects. The boys were grieving, hysterical, the children of the dead. Beverly Hills police took their statements and let them go home with relatives. That decision, criticised heavily in hindsight, would shape the next 6 months of the investigation. The memorial service was held 5 days later, on the 25th of August, at the Directors Guild of America building in Los Angeles. The funeral and burial were a further 3 days after that, at the University Chapel in Princeton on the 28th of August, with burial at Princeton Cemetery. Both events were attended by hundreds of family members, friends, and entertainment industry colleagues. At the LA memorial, the two brothers arrived an hour late. The moment that would later be introduced as evidence at trial, twice, was not at either service itself. It was after. Marlene Eisenberg, who everybody called Marzi, had been Jose Menendez's personal secretary at LIVE Entertainment for years. She knew the family. After the LA memorial service, she rode in a limousine with the two brothers back to the house. Lyle was wearing his murdered father's loafers. Inside the limousine, by Eisenberg's account, he turned to Marzi, made a remark about who said he could not fill his father's shoes, and when she replied that he should make his own tracks instead, he came back at her and told her that she did not understand. These actually were his father's shoes, on his feet, today. Marlene Eisenberg described the exchange under oath as extremely bizarre. She said it had made her, in her words, extremely uncomfortable. She testified to it at the first trial on the 29th of November 1993, and again at the retrial on the 3rd of November 1995. The prosecution introduced the remark as evidence of consciousness of guilt and contempt for the victims. The defense did not try to argue she had invented it. The remark had happened in a slow-moving limousine in Los Angeles traffic 5 days after the killings, with the dead man's son in the dead man's shoes, in front of the woman who had ordered Jose Menendez's coffee for 9 years. Court TV's archive sessions preserve the testimony. The footage is still there to be watched. The case did not break for months. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the Beverly Hills Police initially looked at organised crime, given Jose's industry contacts and his rivals. The brothers, meanwhile, were spending money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, on Rolex watches, on a Porsche, on a $500,000 cafe in Princeton, on a condominium, on business ventures none of them had the experience to run. By October, Eric had begun to break. He confessed to a Beverly Hills psychologist named Jerome Oziel on the 31st of October, 1989, in a private session. Oziel recorded subsequent sessions with both brothers. In March of 1990, Oziel's mistress, Judalon Smith, walked into the Beverly Hills police station and told them about the tapes. After a long legal fight over patient privilege that went all the way to the California Supreme Court, the tapes were admitted as evidence. The lead detective, Les Zola, of the Beverly Hills Police Department, had been suspicious of the brothers for months by then. Lyle was arrested on the 8th of March 1990. Eric turned himself in 3 days later. The trials, when they finally began, became something larger than themselves. The Menendez brothers were the first major American homicide defendants whose trials were broadcast live, gavel to gavel, on the new and untested cable channel called Court TV. The decision to put the abuse claims in front of 2 separate juries was, in 1993, a serious legal and cultural gamble. The first trial began in 1993 at Los Angeles County Superior Court in Van Nuys before Judge Stanley Weisberg. The case was, by then, an American media event. Court TV had launched only 2 years earlier, and the Menendez trials would become, alongside the O.J. Simpson trial that followed in 1995, one of the cases that built the modern televised trial industry. Each brother had his own jury. The defense put the family's alleged abuse history on the stand and built the argument that the boys had killed in fear, not for money. Both juries hung. The first trial ended in mistrial in January of 1994, with the country having watched around 6 months of testimony. The retrial in 1995 and 1996, in front of the same judge, used a single jury for both brothers. The legal strategy this time was different. The prosecution was sharper, the abuse defence was given less courtroom oxygen, and the cameras, by then, had been pulled out under a court order. The retrial proceeded without the daily national audience that the first one had had. The prosecution was led by David Conn. Defence counsel Leslie Abramson represented Eric. On the 20th of March 1996, both brothers were convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including lying in wait and multiple murder. On the 2nd of July 1996, Judge Weisberg sentenced both brothers to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus consecutive time for the conspiracy count. They were sent to separate California state prisons. In 2018, after more than 2 decades apart, they were reunited at the same facility, R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. The brothers stayed in those separate prisons through the long quiet of the early 2000s. The case faded out of cultural memory for a generation. And then, with the arrival of streaming-era true crime, it came back. The case has had a strange second life. In October of 2024, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed a resentencing motion, citing new evidence that, in their view, corroborated some of the abuse claims the boys had testified to 30 years earlier. The motion came after a wave of renewed public attention to the case, driven in part by a Netflix dramatization and in part by a much broader reconsideration of how American courts had treated claims of familial abuse in the 1990s. Resentencing proceedings remain ongoing. Whatever the courts ultimately decide about the brothers' culpability, and the question of whether the abuse defence should have been weighed differently in 1996 than it had been, the limousine ride from the Los Angeles Memorial Service on the 25th of August 1989, with the dead man's shoes on the living son's feet, will be in the record forever. That was the moment Marlene Eisenberg said something inside her went quiet. She had known Jose Menendez for years. She had known her boss. She had ordered his coffee. She had managed his calendar. And on that ride home, sitting next to his son in a private limousine in slow Los Angeles traffic on a hot August afternoon, she heard a remark about a pair of shoes that would never quite leave her. 6 years later, in 2 courtrooms, decades later, in retrospectives, and today. If these breakdowns are the kind of story you want more of, the subscribe button keeps this channel running. It is completely free. The Menendez case was about money and inheritance, and a family torn apart in a single August night. The next case is about a marriage. About a husband who, while the rest of the city was searching for his missing pregnant wife in the cold rain of a California December, was photographed at her candlelight vigil grinning, and made a phone call from inside that crowd, telling a woman 3 time zones away that he was watching New Year's fireworks from the Eiffel Tower. Case 3. Scott Peterson. At 4:20 on the afternoon of the 31st of December 2002, in the city of Modesto, California, a 30-year-old man named Scott Peterson stood at the back of a crowd of 1,300 people who had gathered at a city park to hold a candlelight vigil for his 8 months pregnant wife. She had been missing for 1 week. He had told the police he had spent that morning fishing. He stepped away from the crowd to make a private phone call. The woman on the other end of the line was not his wife. He told her that he was in Paris. He told her he was watching fireworks at the Eiffel Tower. He was, in fact, standing in East La Loma Park in Modesto. The phone call was being recorded by the police. Scott Lee Peterson was born on the 24th of October, 1972, in San Diego. By the end of 2002, he was 30 years old and selling fertilizer for a company called TradeCorp in Modesto, in the agricultural Central Valley of California. He had met his wife, Lacey, when they were both students at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. They had married. They had bought a small home at 523 Covenant Avenue. She was pregnant with their first child. Friends described Scott as charming and easy. His own family described him as steady, controlled, the responsible son. Prosecutors would later describe him as a serial liar. He had no prior criminal record. He was, by every outward measure, a normal married man in the suburbs. He was also, by December of 2002, deeply involved with another woman. Her name was Amber Fry. She was a massage therapist in Fresno, a single mother in her late 20s. They had met in late November through a mutual friend who worked in the same business. He had told her he was a widower. He had told her he had recently lost his wife and was struggling. He had taken her out for dinners and bought her flowers. He had told her about the family and the life he was hoping to build. She did not know that his wife was 8 months pregnant and very much alive in a suburb of Modesto. Lacey Denise Rocha Peterson was 27 years old. She had grown up in Modesto. She had a wide circle of friends. She loved gardening and cooking. She had photographs of herself, taken weeks before her death, standing in her own driveway in the warm weather, 8 months pregnant, with one hand on her belly, smiling at the camera. The kind of smile that is impossible to look at now without flinching. She was a substitute teacher. She was 8 months pregnant with a son the couple had decided to name Connor. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, and her stepfather, Ron Gransky, were close to her. She had told her mother by phone on the evening of the 23rd of December that she would call her again on Christmas Eve. The call never came. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the family's golden retriever Mackenzie was found wandering the neighborhood with a muddy leash dragging behind him. Lacey was gone. What had happened between the night of the 23rd and the morning of the 24th is something the legal system was eventually able to reconstruct only in outline. Lacey had been at home in the late evening of the 23rd. By the time the dog was found wandering with a muddy leash on the morning of the 24th, she was already gone. There was no eyewitness. There was never a confession. There was, in the end, no clear crime scene. What there was, in the months that followed, was a slowly accumulating mountain of circumstantial evidence. Scott had bought a 14-foot aluminium fishing boat for $1,400 in cash on the 9th of December, less than 2 weeks earlier, and had told no one in the family about it. He had researched San Francisco Bay tides and currents on the home laptop on the 8th of December. He had told the police that on the morning of the 24th, he had driven 90 miles to Berkeley Marina and gone fishing alone. He had told them he was home by mid-afternoon. He had told them Lacey was gone when he got back. The Modesto Police Department and the FBI began to look at him almost immediately. On the evening of the 31st of December 2002, the city of Modesto held a candlelight vigil for Lacey Peterson at East La Loma Park. About 1,300 people came. Lacey's family stood on the main stage. Scott Peterson stood at the back of the crowd. Multiple friends of the family later testified that he seemed cheerful that evening, that he was relaxed, that he was in a good mood. Several of them later told prosecutors he had appeared somewhat jovial. Photographs of him at the vigil, smiling, were entered into evidence at his trial as People's Exhibits 24, 25, and 26. The Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office, in its trial brief, summarized those photographs and those witness statements very simply. While Lacey's family wept on a stage, while a city held candles in the cold for his missing pregnant wife, Scott Peterson, the husband, looked like a man enjoying his evening. At exactly 4:20 that afternoon, half an hour before the vigil began, Scott had stepped away to make a phone call. The call went to Amber Fry, the woman in Fresno he had been seeing for the past month, who he had told he was a widower. Amber had seen newspaper coverage of Lacey's disappearance the day before. She had recognized Scott. She had walked into the Modesto Police Department and given them her story, and the police had asked her to keep talking to him and to let them record the calls. So when Scott Peterson called Amber Fry at 4:20 on the 31st of December 2002, the police were listening. He told her he was in Paris. He told her he was watching New Year's fireworks at the Eiffel Tower. He told her, as a kind of detail to make it sound real, that the fireworks were pretty awesome there. He was, in fact, standing in East La Loma Park, Modesto, California, with his murdered pregnant wife's family weeping on a stage 100 yards away. He called Amber again at 1 minute past midnight to wish her a happy new year. The recordings of those calls became some of the most damning evidence at his trial. A jury would later listen to them in silence. Months passed. The disappearance had become a national American story within days of Christmas Eve. The face of Lacey Peterson, pregnant and smiling, was on every front page in California by the end of December. Scott Peterson appeared on Good Morning America in January and gave a series of interviews that, in retrospect, contributed as much to his eventual conviction as any single piece of physical evidence. He was, by then, also still on the phone with Amber Fry, every recorded call playing eventually for the jury. The search effort was enormous. Volunteers walked Modesto, divers worked the Sacramento Delta. Scott Peterson held press conferences and spoke publicly about his missing wife, in the same weeks he was building a future with Amber Fry. Lacey's family was, in private, becoming convinced of what they could not yet say. The body did not surface until April. On the 13th of April 2003, the partial remains of a male fetus washed ashore at Point Isabel in Richmond, on the northeast shore of San Francisco Bay. The next day, the remains of an adult woman washed ashore about a mile away. DNA testing confirmed within days that the remains were Lacey and Connor Peterson. On the 18th of April 2003, Modesto police arrested Scott Peterson near Torrey Pines Golf Course in La Jolla, just north of San Diego, 90 miles north of the Mexican border. His hair had been bleached blonde, his beard had been grown out. He was carrying just under $15,000 in cash. He had his brother's identification on him and a load of camping gear in the car. He had been heading south toward Mexico. The intent, prosecutors would later argue, was unmistakable. The story of the trial was the story of public attention. Cable news ran the case as a daily lead for months. Court TV again carried the proceedings gavel to gavel, the way it had with the Menendez retrial. The trial was moved out of Stanislaus County to San Mateo County Superior Court in Redwood City because of pre-trial publicity, before Judge Alfred DeLucci. The lead prosecutor was Rick DiStarzo. The defense was led by the celebrity attorney Mark Geragos. The trial ran for 6 months. The case against Peterson was almost entirely circumstantial. The boat, the Bay research, the affair, the demeanour at the vigil, the Eiffel Tower call, the bleached hair, the cash, the brother's identification. The circumstances had stacked up too high to overcome. On the 12th of November 2004, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for Connor. The penalty jury returned a death recommendation on the 13th of December. Judge DeLucci imposed death on the 16th of March 2005 and sent him to San Quentin. That sentence did not hold. In August of 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned the death sentence on the grounds of jury selection error. In December of 2021, Peterson was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He is now held at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, where he is expected to remain for the rest of his life. The Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a petition for a new trial. As of the most recent reporting, that petition had been denied at the trial court level, and appeals continued. Lacey's family asked that her gravestone read Lacey Denise Rocha. They left the Peterson name off entirely. Connor Peterson, the son who never lived, lies in the same grave under his given name only. The choice was, on its own terms, an act of erasure. Sharon Rocha would later say that her daughter had been a Rocha first and last, and that the family was not prepared to leave the name of the man who had killed her on the stone they would visit for the rest of their lives. In April of 2004, while the investigation was still underway, President George W. Bush signed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, which made it a separate federal offence to cause the death or injury of an unborn child during the commission of certain crimes against a pregnant woman. The press called it Lacey and Connor's Law. Sharon Rocha had lobbied for it. The Peterson case is about a husband. The next is about a young man on the cusp of his own wedding day, about a future son-in-law who, 6 days before he was supposed to walk down the aisle, walked into his future mother-in-law's kitchen and killed her, and then served as a pallbearer at her funeral, in the very same church where the wedding had been booked, on the very Saturday the wedding was supposed to take place. Case 4. Jeffrey Scullin Jr. On a Saturday in late October of 2017, a Lutheran church in the Cleveland suburb of Strongsville, Ohio, held a funeral for a beloved middle school teacher. Among the pallbearers carrying her casket out of the front door was a 20-year-old man with no job, a high school grade point average of 0, and a recent history of staging fake break-ins at her home. He was her daughter's fiancé. The funeral was being held on what was supposed to be his wedding day. The church was the church the wedding had been booked at, and 6 days earlier, he had been the one who killed her. Jeffrey Scullin Jr. was 20 years old at the time. He lived in Strongsville, in the Pleskovic family home, with his fiancée Anna Pleskovic and their 1-year-old daughter. His own father had been a Cleveland police officer. He had dropped out of high school with a grade point average of 0. He had no criminal record, no recent employment, and very few prospects. He had recently applied for a marriage license with Anna. The wedding had been booked at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Strongsville for the 28th of October, 2017. The credit card he was using to make payments to the wedding venue had been declined 14 times in a row. The venue had emailed Anna's mother to say that if the next payment did not clear, the wedding would be cancelled for non-payment. The wedding was being paid for by Anna's parents. Melinda, by the late summer of that year, had begun asking serious questions about her future son-in-law. She had been asking him about his job prospects. She had been asking him about how he intended to provide for her daughter and her grandchild. She had, prosecutors would later argue, started pulling at the threads of the life he had built inside her home, and he had known it. To Melinda, those questions were the questions any mother asks before she gives her daughter away. To Scullin, prosecutors would say, they were existential. Her name was Melinda Showman Pleskovic. She was 49. She had taught middle school English at Strongsville Middle School for more than 20 years. She was a coach. She was a mother of 3, including a young son with special needs. She was, in every account that survives, the kind of teacher every middle school faculty has at most one of at a time. The kind who shows up early, who runs the after-school clubs, who pays for her own classroom supplies, who keeps small piles of granola bars in her desk drawer for kids who say they are not hungry. Within hours of her death, the community would begin organising scholarships in her name. The Melinda Showman Pleskovic Memorial Fund exists to this day. On the night of the 23rd of October 2017, just 5 days before her daughter's wedding, Melinda was supposed to meet her husband Bruce and her future son-in-law at an Applebee's for dinner. The dinner was meant to be a final family meeting in advance of the wedding day. She did not arrive. Bruce called the home phone. There was no answer. He drove home with Jeffrey. They walked in. They found her on the kitchen floor. They called 911 at around 8:30 at night. The cause of death, as the Cuyahoga County medical examiner would later determine, was multiple injuries inflicted with both a firearm and a knife. She had been killed in her own kitchen on a Monday evening in October, in the home she was about to give her daughter away from in 5 days. The school where she taught held a vigil within 48 hours. Students lined the hallway of Strongsville Middle School with handwritten signs. Colleagues described her in the local paper as the kind of teacher every parent in the district had hoped to draw. The Pleskovic family, in the same 48 hours, was trying to plan a funeral on top of the wedding that was supposed to fill that same Saturday. The funeral was held on Saturday, the 28th of October 2017, at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Strongsville. Among the pallbearers carrying Melinda's casket out the front doors of the sanctuary was her future son-in-law, Jeffrey Scullin Jr. The video of him bearing the casket aired that weekend on the Cleveland affiliates and was picked up nationally. Cleveland's local CBS affiliate reported it plainly. The suspect in the killing of Strongsville teacher Melinda Pleskovic had not only attended her funeral, he had served as a pallbearer. What the broadcast did not say at the time, because it had not yet been arrested out into public view, was that the 28th of October was the day the wedding had been booked for, at that same church, at that same time of day. The mother of the bride was instead being carried, by the groom, out of the sanctuary she was supposed to walk her daughter into. Strongsville police, under Chief Mark Fender, had been suspicious of Scullin from the first night. He had been the second 911 caller. He had been the one to find the body alongside Bruce. He had also been the only witness to 2 recent reported break-ins at the Pleskovic home that had turned up no forensic evidence and no fingerprints. Investigators had quietly concluded both of those reports were staged. The earlier one, in August, had been used to soften the family up to the idea that a burglar might come back. The second, 4 days before the killing, was, in retrospect, the rehearsal. The bigger question was whether they could prove it. They could. DNA from Melinda's blood was found on a large tactical knife in the back seat of Scullin's truck. Scullin's own DNA was on the knife handle. His DNA was also on a revolver inside a backpack in the same vehicle, and on the waistband of a pair of sweatpants that carried forensic traces tying him to the scene. His cell phone had been at the Pleskovich home at the time of the killing. On the 1st of November 2017, 8 days after Melinda's death and 4 days after the funeral he had served at, Scullin gave a videotaped confession to Strongsville detective Ron Stoltz. In the confession, he tried repeatedly to blame the killing on a sudden break from reality. He told the detective he had not planned it. The forensic record disagreed. The pattern of staged break-ins running back into the late summer of that year, the credit card payment failures, the deteriorating relationship with Melinda, all painted the same picture in the same direction. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, when it reviewed the file, charged him with aggravated murder, which in Ohio is the most serious homicide charge the state has, and which is reserved for killings with prior calculation and design. The case went to Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas before Judge Pamela Barker. The county prosecutor's office was led on this file by Assistant Prosecutor Andrew Santoli. The defense, led by attorney Joseph Patitus, tried to suppress the confession. Judge Barker, after a 3-day hearing in 2018, denied the motion. On the 22nd of October 2018, the day his jury trial was set to begin, Scullin changed his plea to no contest on all 6 charges, which included aggravated murder, felonious assault, tampering with evidence, making false alarms, and endangering children. Judge Barker found him guilty the same day. On the 29th of October 2018, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Melinda's funeral, in the same county courthouse where Cuyahoga County tries its homicides, Scullin was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years. Anna Pleskovic, the daughter who had been engaged to him, who had moved out of the family home after the killing, addressed the court at sentencing. She called him a manipulator, a pathological liar, a thief, a sociopath, and, in her last and hardest word, a sadistic killer. She told the court he should never be allowed to walk free again. He was given 363 days of jail credit and shipped to an Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction facility. His federal habeas petition under case number 1:21 Civil 00485 was denied, and his Ohio state appeals have all been denied. The Ohio Supreme Court declined to take the case in March of 2020. The Sixth Circuit later denied his federal motion. He remains incarcerated in Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction custody, with no realistic path to release before the early 2050s, when he will be in his mid-50s. His parole eligibility date sits in the formal Ohio sentencing calculus in the year 2051. Anna Pleskovich kept their young daughter. The Pleskovich family, in the years since, has continued to do the work of grief together. Bruce stayed in the house. The kitchen, the room where Melinda had been killed, was eventually renovated. He has continued to work in the same Cleveland suburb. He has continued to live in the same town. The community of Strongsville continues to mark Melinda's death with the Memorial Fund and with scholarships in her name at Strongsville City Schools. The annual middle school awards ceremony at Strongsville carries her name. Students who would have been in her classroom that academic year have since graduated. The school district has put up a small memorial plaque in the hallway outside what had been her classroom. She is buried in Strongsville. Her grave is in the cemetery a short walk from St. Paul Lutheran Church, the same church where she was supposed to give her daughter away that Saturday afternoon, and where, in the event, her son-in-law-to-be carried her body out of the sanctuary instead. Anna Pleskovic, now in her late 20s, has spoken at the sentencing and at subsequent appellate hearings, every time, the words always close to the same. She has said, in court and in writing, that what was taken from her family on the 23rd of October 2017 was not just her mother. It was the wedding day she had planned. It was the version of the future she had pictured for the daughter she shared with the man who had killed Melinda. It was, in her words, every birthday party and Christmas dinner and ordinary Tuesday her mother was supposed to have shown up for. The wedding day she had planned for, and the funeral that took its place became, in the public record of the case, the same Saturday, on the same calendar page, in the same building, with the same man at the centre of both events. If you want the rest of this list when it lands, hit subscribe. It is free, and it is the simplest way to make sure the next case finds you. The sculling case was an inside-the-family killing, where the pallbearer at the funeral was the killer. The next case keeps the same shape, but stretches it across an entire workplace, an entire city, and a live television broadcast. The killer in the next case was a respected charity director with a master's degree in education. The woman he killed was his boss, and the day after he killed her at a bus stop in North Philadelphia, he sat down on camera with a local television reporter and told the entire city that he was just stunned. Case 5. Randolph Sanders. On a January morning in 2015, a 56-year-old woman named Kim Jones was killed at a North Philadelphia bus stop while listening to gospel music in her headphones, waiting for the Route 23 bus. Less than 24 hours later, the man who had killed her was sitting on a bench inside their shared workplace, in a plaid scarf and cuffed jeans, telling a local ABC reporter that everyone in the office was just stunned. He went to her funeral days later. He shook her family's hands. The reason he had killed her was that she had been about to expose his theft of $40,000 in city money. Randolph Sanders was 36 years old. He lived in northeast Philadelphia on Ryerson Road. He held a master's degree in education from Cheney University of Pennsylvania, where he had also played wide receiver for the football team. He had a wife. He had children. He was, by every external measure, one of the more accomplished 36-year-olds in his social circle. He was personable. He was well-spoken. He was the kind of man, his employer would later say, that people inside the agency described as a future executive in the making. In 2013, he had been fired from one Philadelphia nonprofit, the Women's Christian Alliance Foster Care Agency, and had sued, claiming retaliation. He had then been hired by another nonprofit, Turning Points for Children, as the assistant director of a program called Families and Schools Together, which the agency ran under contract with the city of Philadelphia. His salary was $68,000. His direct supervisor at Turning Points, the program director who had hired him, was a 56-year-old woman named Kimberly Jones. Kim Jones, who everybody called Kim, had grown up in North Philadelphia. She had an MBA. She had built a career, first in business, and had moved into child advocacy in her late 40s as a second career, with the deliberate idea that she wanted to spend the back half of her working life doing something that helped the children in the neighborhoods she had come from. She supervised 62 city schools under the Families and Schools Together program. She had a son named Jean-Paul and a daughter, both adults. She had a husband, and she had been recently remarried in the last year of her life. People who worked with her described her as humble, devoted, and selfless. She did not drive into work. She rode the SEPTA bus every morning, the Route 23, from her neighborhood to the agency offices in Center City. She listened to gospel music on her headphones on that ride, every weekday morning, the same way she had for years. By the end of 2014, Kim Jones had begun looking very carefully at the financial records of the program she was supervising. What she found, by the second week of January in 2015, was that there was approximately $42,000 in FAST program stipends that had gone out over the course of the past calendar year to 29 different people. None of those 29 people had personnel files at the agency. Most of them, on closer review, turned out to be Randolph Sanders' college fraternity brothers, his friends, and his acquaintances. On the 12th of January 2015, she confronted Sanders with what she had found and told him she would be reporting the discrepancy to the Department of Human Services the following morning. The following morning was the 13th of January 2015. At 9:15 in the morning, Kim Jones stood at a SEPTA bus stop at 12th and Jefferson Streets in the Yorktown neighborhood of North Philadelphia, waiting for the Route 23 bus, with gospel music in her headphones. A man in dark clothing, hood up, climbed an inclined lawn behind her, walked up to her from behind, and killed her with a single shot from very close range. Within 15 minutes, he had called her mobile phone and left a voicemail asking if she was okay. Philadelphia Police Captain James Clark, who would later run the investigation, called the killing a premeditated, targeted murder. Captain Clark, in a press conference 2 weeks after the killing, said the department had been working the case from the morning of the 13th as a planned, professional killing. The bus stop location, the timing within an hour of the planned report to the Department of Human Services, and the cold, mechanical efficiency of the approach all told the homicide unit the same thing. This was somebody who had decided, in advance, that she had to be stopped from speaking the next morning. 6ABC, the local ABC affiliate, treated the killing as the lead story that night. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran it on the front page. By the morning of the 14th, the entire Families and Schools Together team was in shock. Kim had been their boss, but she had also been, by every account, the heart of the program. What the killing of Kim Jones is remembered for, though, is not what happened at the bus stop. It is what happened in the days and weeks that followed. The first thing was the television interview. On the morning of the 14th of January 2015, 24 hours after the killing, the local ABC affiliate in Philadelphia, 6ABC, sent its veteran reporter Vernon Odom to Turning Points for Children to do a piece on the team's reaction. Randolph Sanders, the assistant director, sat down with him. In the camera frame, he wore a plaid scarf, cuffed jeans, and a neatly trimmed beard. He told Vernon Odom 3 times in succession that everybody at the agency was just stunned. He added, on camera, that he had been fortunate enough to be invited to Kim's recent wedding, and that she had been incredibly happy there. The clip aired that night across the Philadelphia area. The second thing was the funeral. Kim Jones was buried in Philadelphia within days of her death. Sanders attended. He shook the hands of her family. Her son, Jean-Paul, in a later interview with the Philadelphia Daily News, would say that the fact that this man had been able to look his family members in the eye and shake his hand on the day of his mother's funeral was to him flat out unimaginable. The chief executive of Turning Points for Children, Michael Vogel, would later say that the agency had not just had a colleague killed, they had had a colleague grieve with them, speculate with them about who could have done it, and go to her funeral. Philadelphia Police Homicide, under Captain James Clark and Deputy Commissioner Richard Ross, did not look at Sanders first. They had no reason to. They pulled surveillance video from Temple University campus cameras and from SEPTA. They traced a hooded figure leaving the bus stop, walking across the Temple campus, dropping down into the Broad Street subway at Susquehanna Dolphin Station, riding north, getting off at Broad and Hunting Park, and walking 3 blocks to a 2007 silver GMC Yukon parked on Carlisle Street. Detectives recognized the make and the model. The Yukon belonged to Randolph Sanders. On the 1st of February 2015, 3 weeks after the killing, they brought him in. Sanders confessed on videotape that same day. He told them, in a phrase that would later be played for the jury, that it had been a work-related matter and that it had just got out of hand. 3 guns were recovered at his home. The internal forensic audit at Turning Points subsequently confirmed the $42,000 stipend fraud, with 29 ghost recipients, most of them his college fraternity brothers. The story made national news the week of the killing. The combination of the bus stop setting, the gospel music in the headphones, the charity colleague turned killer, and the on-camera grief performance the next morning struck people as something close to fiction. The Daily News, in a column that ran on the 2nd of February 2015, the day after Sanders' arrest, called him the smiling assassin. The case went to the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas before Judge Glenn Bronson. The assistant district attorney was Mark Levenberg. The trial ran for 2 weeks in February and March of 2017, 2 years after the killing. Sanders took the stand and maintained under oath that he had not killed Kim Jones and that he had not stolen any money. Under cross-examination, the videotaped confession was played for the courtroom. The jury heard Sanders telling detectives, in his own voice, in his own words, that it had been a work-related matter that had got out of hand. They heard him telling detectives how he had bought the gun and how he had been carrying it for protection. The contradiction between the confession and the witness stand denial was the kind of contradiction that, in front of 12 people, does not survive. The jury did not believe him. The evidence against him included the videotaped confession, the surveillance trail across half of North Philadelphia the matching GMC Yukon, the stipend fraud audit, the 6 ABC interview, and the funeral attendance. Judge Bronson, who had been on the bench for decades, told the courtroom afterward that the prosecution's case was some of the most overwhelming evidence he had seen in his entire career. On the 6th of March 2017, the jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for 2 hours and returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Pennsylvania law imposes a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. Sanders was sentenced accordingly and shipped to the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, where he remains today. The agency he had worked for, Turning Points for Children, conducted a full internal financial review and continued to operate. The case became a national cautionary tale in non-profit governance, written up in trade publications for the field as an example of how a single trusted employee could move more than $40,000 in stipends out of a city contract over the course of a year before anyone noticed. The bigger story, the one Kim's son Jean-Paul returned to in every interview he gave, was not the money. It was the funeral. It was the handshake. It was the fact that a man with that much capacity for performance had been able to stand inside their grief and feel comfortable. No memorial fund has been publicly attached to Kim Jones's name, in the way that other victims on this list have had foundations and scholarships set up for them. What there is, on the corner of 12th and Jefferson Streets in Yorktown, is a bus stop. A Route 23 bus comes by every weekday morning around 9:15. Kim Jones is not there anymore. The Sanders case was a workplace betrayal in which the killer turned up at the office the next morning, gave a television interview about how stunned he was, and then went to the funeral. The next case is a friendship betrayal of a much stranger kind. The killer in the next case moved into the victim's family home after the funeral, comforted the dead girl's mother every night for 3 years, and slept in a bedroom down the hall from where the dead girl's photograph still hung on the wall. The mother never suspected a thing. Case 6. Karen Severson. In October of 1985, a 17-year-old girl was killed in a stream in the Angeles National Forest, north of Los Angeles. She was found face down under a 4-foot log in 6 inches of water, with her long hair hacked off. Her best friend since the age of 8 attended her funeral, sat with her mother, and told the family she would not rest until they knew who had done it. 3 weeks later, that best friend moved into the dead girl's mother's home with her own baby. She slept in a bedroom down the hall from the dead girl's room. She stayed for 3 years. The killer's name was Karen Severson. She was 17 years old at the time. She lived in Arleta, a working-class neighborhood in the north end of the San Fernando Valley, in the Los Angeles Basin. She had been best friends with the girl she killed since they were both 8 years old. The friendship had been one of those tight, exclusive teenage friendships that the people around the 2 girls had always assumed would soften as they got older. They had grown up on the same streets, gone to the same schools, met the same boys, traded the same secrets. By 1985, that friendship had soured into something else. Severson, by the accounts that came out at trial and afterward, was the dominant one in their group of 3, jealous of the attention her best friend got from boys at San Fernando High School. She had been spreading rumours about her best friend's promiscuity for months. The rumours had reached the school. The best friend had been attacked at school by a group of girls a few weeks before her death, a beating that left her bruised and shaken. The rumours, as far as anybody who has worked the case in the years since has been able to determine, had been entirely invented. They had come, in their entirety, from Karen Severson. Missy Avila had no idea, in the autumn of 1985, that the person spreading the stories that had led to her being assaulted in a school corridor was the person she trusted most in the world. The third girl in the group, Laura Doyle, also 17, was Severson's co-conspirator and would later be tried alongside her. The girl who was killed was Michelle Yvette Avila, who everybody called Missy. She had been born on the 8th of February 1968. She was 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 97 pounds. She had waist-length brown hair. She was the only daughter of a woman named Irene Avila, who, by every account that survives, raised her with a kind of devotion that had been complete and lifelong. She had brothers who loved her. She had a wide circle of friends at San Fernando High. She was, by every photograph and every yearbook entry that survives her, a pretty, bright, popular junior in high school, 4 months away from her 18th birthday. On the afternoon of the 1st of October 1985, Laura Doyle came by Missy's home in Arleta and told her they were going out. Missy got into Doyle's car. Doyle drove her up into the Angeles National Forest, north of the valley, into the Big Tahunga Canyon area. Severson and a fourth teenage girl were already there. What happened in that canyon on a Tuesday afternoon in early October has been pieced together over the years from forensic findings and from the eventual testimony of the fourth girl who had been there. Missy was confronted. She was beaten. Her long brown hair was hacked off her head. She was drowned face down in approximately 6 inches of creek water. A 4-foot log, weighing close to 100 pounds, was placed across her body. Her hoop earrings had been torn from her ears. Missy was not, in any account from any of the 3 girls who knew what had happened, given a chance to defend herself. She was held down. Her hair was cut from her head with what investigators later believed to have been a pair of household scissors. The hoop earrings she had worn that morning, when she had got into Doyle's car expecting to spend an ordinary afternoon, were torn from her ears. About 4 hours later, Laura Doyle picked up a phone and called Irene Avila. She told Irene that Missy had left a park with 3 boys in a blue Camaro and had asked Doyle not to wait for her. Irene reported her daughter missing within the hour. On the 4th of October 1985, 3 days later, hikers in Tahunga Canyon found Missy's body in the stream. Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies recovered her from the water. The autopsy established cause of death as forced drowning. The log across her body, deliberately placed, suggested the act was not, at any moment, accidental. The killing was a homicide from the morning the body was recovered. Missy Avila's funeral was held in the Los Angeles area within days of her body being identified. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle attended together. Doyle sent the Avila family a sympathy card with $20 tucked inside it. Severson did something different. Within weeks of the funeral, Karen Severson moved into the Avila family home with her own baby, ostensibly to console her dead best friend's mother. She slept there. She ate her breakfasts there. She lay in bed in the room across the hall from Missy's bedroom, where Missy's photograph still hung on the wall. She spent hours sitting with Irene Avila in the evenings. She offered theories about who might have killed Missy. She helped, in the early period, with what the family was calling, in their grief, the investigation. The arrangement lasted approximately 3 years. Irene Avila, on the record to ABC7 Los Angeles, and to the journalist Karen Kingsbury for her later book, has said the same thing in slightly different forms over the years. The girl who had killed her daughter had her fooled. She had her daughter-in-law fooled. She had her sons fooled. Everybody had been fooled. Irene had not seen the first thing wrong. The case went cold for almost 3 years. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had no physical evidence and no eyewitnesses, and the investigation had no real direction. Detectives interviewed Severson early on. She gave them the same account Doyle had given Irene Avila, of boys in a blue Camaro, and offered to help in any way she could. She gave them, over the months that followed, what they would later understand to have been a deliberate stream of theories aimed at moving the investigation away from her. None of them led anywhere. The break came in 1988, almost 3 years to the day after the killing. The fourth girl, who had been there in the canyon, who had been silent for 36 months, who had spent her late teens and her early 20s living with what she had seen, walked into a police station and gave a full account. Her testimony matched the forensic record exactly. She described the drowning, the log, the hair. She named Severson and Doyle. The break-in evidence had been there all along. The two were arrested at separate addresses in the San Fernando Valley in 1989, on the same morning, in coordinated arrests by the Sheriff's Department. The two were arrested at separate addresses in the San Fernando Valley in 1989, on the same morning, in coordinated arrests by the Sheriff's Department. Karen Severson was, by then, a young woman with a child of her own. She had moved on from the Avila home eventually, into her own apartment, having maintained the fiction of grieving friend right up to the moment the LA County Sheriff's deputies came for her. The trial in 1990 at Los Angeles County Superior Court was prosecuted by Deputy District Attorney Tamia Hope. She told the courtroom that Missy's only problem on that October afternoon had been that she was very popular with boys, and that this had driven Karen Severson and Laura Doyle crazy. The jury accepted the prosecution's account in part. They rejected the first-degree premeditation argument and instead returned a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. On the 10th of March 1990, Severson and Doyle were each sentenced to 15 years to life. Severson was paroled on the 9th of December 2011 after 21.5 years in custody. Doyle was paroled a year later, in December of 2012, after roughly 22 years. The Avila family, led by Irene, had attended every parole hearing for both of them, every one of which had been denied until the last. They had read victim impact statements at every hearing. They had spoken about Missy in the same composed voice they had been using in interviews since 1990. The Avila family did not stop speaking publicly when the killers got out. Karen Kingsbury's 1991 book, called Missy's Murder, told the case in detail. In 2014, Severson signed a deal to write a memoir and a film treatment about her crime and her years in prison. The Avila family went to court in 2015 to seize the proceeds. By the time the Avila family went to court, the picture was less clear than headlines suggested. Severson's distributor told ABC7 Los Angeles that very few of the books had sold and that Severson had not at that point made any money from them. The lawsuit was, in part, about principle. The Avila family did not want a convicted killer to be in a position to profit from telling Missy's story at any point in the future, regardless of whether the first attempt at it had worked commercially. California subsequently passed a piece of legislation that the press came to call Missy's Law, modelled on Son of Sam statutes that had been used in other American jurisdictions, requiring publishers to notify victims' families when convicted offenders sought to profit from work based on their crimes. The law was not a one-to-one replacement for the older Son of Sam framework, which the California Supreme Court had struck down in 2002, but it carried Missy Avila's name in everyday speech. Irene Avila, on every anniversary that has come since, has spoken about her daughter to whichever Los Angeles outlet asked. She has worked with Crime Victims United, the California advocacy organization, for decades. She has spoken, on camera and in print, about parenting a daughter through the version of teenage life that was 1985 San Fernando, with all the small, petty cruelties of high school that, in her daughter's case, had been organized quietly by a friend Missy had trusted since they were both small children. She has never, in any of those interviews, been able to put words to the 3 years in which she had her daughter's killer sleeping under her own roof, comforting her at night, eating breakfast with her in the mornings, walking through the kitchen with her own baby in her arms. The arrangement, by her own account, had not ended because she had figured out what Severson had done. It had ended because Severson had been arrested. The Severson case is about a friendship turned into something monstrous and a grieving mother who never suspected the woman comforting her. The next case is the same shape on a different axis. A romantic relationship, an obsessive ex-girlfriend, a Mormon motivational speaker found in his own shower in Mesa, Arizona, and a memorial service 8 days later where the killer walked in among the mourners, sat with his friends, offered her condolences, and then stopped by the local police department on the way out of town to give them her fingerprints. If you have made it this far, hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm to send the next file your way. Case 7. Jodi Arias. In June of 2008, a young Mormon motivational speaker named Travis Alexander was killed inside the shower of his home in Mesa, Arizona. 8 days later, the ex-girlfriend who had killed him drove from California to Mesa, walked into a memorial gathering that his friends were holding for him, sat among the mourners, and offered them her condolences. While she was in town, she stopped by the Mesa Police Department and voluntarily provided detectives with her fingerprints and a swab of her saliva for DNA testing. Travis Alexander's friends, watching her at the memorial, would later say something about her presence there had struck them as deeply, openly wrong. Jodi Ann Arias was born on the 9th of July 1980 in Salinas, California. She was 27 years old at the time of the killing. She had dropped out of Wairika Union High School in the 11th grade. She was an aspiring photographer and worked sales for a company called Prepaid Legal Services. She met Travis Alexander in September of 2006 at a prepaid legal conference in Las Vegas. She converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to follow him, and was baptized by Alexander himself on the 26th of November 2006. The conversion being one she would later describe in court testimony as genuine and one his friends would describe as a maneuver. They dated from February of 2007 through June of that year. They broke up. The relationship, however, continued on and off as a secret physical one for another year, against the better judgment of Alexander, who told his closest friends he was trying to extract himself from it. By the spring of 2008, she had moved from Mesa back to Wairika, California, to live with her grandparents, and was stalking Alexander in ways his friends, the Hugheses and Mimi Hall, were beginning to notice. She had, by their later accounts to police and at trial, vandalized his car. She had broken into his email. She had shown up at places he had told her to stop showing up at. She had, by his friends' later accounts, made his last year of life one of escalating discomfort, the kind of obsession the people around him had begun to call dangerous before they had any reason to think it would end the way it did. Travis Victor Alexander had been born on the 28th of July 1977 in Riverside, California. He was 30 years old at the time of his death. He had grown up in a family that had been through hardship, and he had built his adult life around the Mormon faith, around motivational speaking, and around his work as a prepaid legal salesman. He was a Mormon motivational speaker and a prepaid legal salesman, ambitious, with a tight-knit Mormon friendship circle in Mesa that included a couple named Chris and Sky Hughes and a woman named Mimi Hall, who he had been quietly dating in the weeks before he was killed. He lived in a house on East Queensboro Avenue in Mesa. On the 28th of May 2008, a quarter-caliber pistol was reported stolen during a burglary at Jodi Arias' grandparents' home in Wairika. Prosecutors would later argue she had staged that burglary herself. On the 2nd of June, she rented a white Ford Focus from a budget rental location in Redding, California, and picked up gas cans from an ex-boyfriend named Darryl Brewer. On the 4th of June, she drove to Mesa, arrived at Alexander's house, took a series of time-stamped digital photographs of him in the shower with her camera, and then killed him. The cause of death was a combination of multiple penetrating wounds, an injury to the neck, and a single gunshot to the head. The gunshot may have been delivered after death. There were defensive wounds on his hands. The body would be found by friends 5 days later, on the 9th of June, after he had failed to show up for a planned trip to Cancun, Mexico, and stopped answering his phone. His friends had a key. They went to the house. They found him on the bathroom floor. The lead detective who would catch the case, Esteban Flores of Mesa Police, would later say that the scene was one of the hardest he had worked. The friends, by their own later accounts, did not sleep for days. What Jodi Arias did in the days after she killed him is what made the case famous. She drove from Mesa straight to West Jordan, Utah, where she arrived at the home of a man named Ryan Burns on the 5th of June, with newly dyed dark hair and small cuts on her hands. She spent the night there. She had, in her own later testimony, been working on what she would call her alibi. On the 17th of June, 8 days after the body was found, she drove back to Mesa for the memorial gathering Travis Alexander's friends were holding. She walked into that gathering as a former girlfriend of the deceased, offered her condolences, and sat among the mourners. Friends of his, including Sky Hughes, would later describe her presence at the gathering as openly creepy and intrusive. They felt, in the room, that there was something about her behaviour that did not belong. Some of them, in interviews given later to Dr. Drew on HLN and to ABC News, were specific about it. She was inserting herself into a grief she had no right to. And while she was in Mesa on that trip, she stopped by the Mesa Police Department. She sat down with Detective Esteban Flores. She voluntarily provided her fingerprints and a swab of her saliva for DNA testing. She did this, as Detective Flores would later confirm on ABC News, of her own accord before she was officially a suspect. Her name had been in the file from the beginning. The Hugheses had given it to police. But she had not yet been treated as the suspect, and she had walked into the police department voluntarily, sat across from a homicide detective, and given him the very samples that would eventually convict her. Detective Flores, by his own description of the meeting later, watched her do it, accepted the samples, thanked her, and walked her out. The case broke very fast. Mesa police had recovered Alexander's digital camera from his washing machine. The memory card had been wiped, but forensic recovery brought back the deleted images. Among them were time-stamped photographs of Alexander and Arias together at his house on the 4th of June, including post-death photographs of Alexander on the bathroom floor, and one accidental image of Arias herself, captured near the body. A palm print at the scene came back as a mixed sample of Alexander's and Arias's blood. The fingerprints and the DNA she had given them voluntarily in June were now matched to the scene. On the 9th of July 2008, 1 month after the body was discovered, a Maricopa County grand jury indicted Jodi Arias on first-degree murder charges. 6 days later, on the 15th of July, Detective Esteban Flores travelled to Yreka, California, and arrested her at her grandparents' home. She pleaded not guilty on the 11th of September. From that point forward, she was held in custody. The case worked its way through the Maricopa County pre-trial process for over 4 years before opening to the jury. The pre-trial period stretched from her arrest in July of 2008 through the end of 2012. Arias had 2 changes of defense counsel in that window. The trial, when it finally opened, came almost 5 years after the killing. The trial began in January of 2013 at the Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, before Judge Sherry Stevens, with the lead prosecutor Juan Martinez. Arias took the stand for 18 days during the trial, an unusually long run for a defendant in her own homicide case. Her testimony was televised. Her account had shifted 3 times over the course of the investigation, from a denial that she had been anywhere near Mesa on the 4th of June, to a claim that 2 intruders, a man and a woman, had killed Alexander while she had hidden in fear, to a final settled defence of self-defence. The last account included sexual abuse allegations against Alexander that the prosecution worked to dismantle and that the jury did not accept. The cross-examination by Juan Martinez became the kind of thing cable news shows ran in highlight reels every evening for weeks. The image of her face under his questions became one of the more recognisable images of American legal television in the early 2010s. On the 8th of May 2013, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder. The penalty phase deadlocked, 8-4 in favour of death. The second penalty jury, in March of 2015, also deadlocked, this time 11-1 in favour of death. Under Arizona law, 2 hung penalty juries forced the court to impose a non-death sentence. On the 13th of April 2015, Judge Stevens sentenced Jodi Arias to natural life without the possibility of parole. She is held at the Arizona State Prison Complex at Perryville, in the Lumley Unit in Goodyear, Arizona, west of Phoenix. She will not be released. A 2020 appellate decision upheld her conviction, despite finding that the lead prosecutor had engaged in what the appellate court called egregious misconduct. Juan Martinez was later disbarred for unrelated conduct. The Arias case became a cable news phenomenon, the kind of trial that ran live every day on HLN for months. Nancy Grace covered it nightly. Dr. Drew had a regular evening segment about it. The verdict, when it came down on the 8th of May 2013, was treated at the time as a kind of national event. Crowds gathered outside the Maricopa County Courthouse to watch live screens. Books followed. Shanna Hogan published Picture Perfect later that year. Jane Velez Mitchell published Exposed. The Lifetime Network and later Hulu made dramatizations. Travis Alexander's family, including his brother Stephen Alexander, gave dozens of interviews. They had been there in court for every day of the trial. They had sat across the courtroom from her, in the front row, for 4.5 months, listening to her testify for 18 days about a man who could no longer answer her. By the time the verdict came down, the family had been carrying the case for almost 5 years. The Mormon friendship circle that had loved Travis Alexander had, by then, given dozens of interviews. Sky Hughes and Chris Hughes had spoken on camera about the memorial in Mesa. They had described the way Arias had walked in, sat among them, taken their hugs, accepted their condolences, while carrying a secret that would not come out for another month. The Arias case is one person killing one person. The next case is one person killing 11. The killer in the next case worked the Taco Bell near a North Carolina shopping mall and, between 1990 and 1994, killed 11 young black women, most of them his friends, co-workers, or the friends of his sister. He attended their funerals. He hugged their mothers. And in the years since, the city of Charlotte has not forgotten what it took the police as long as it did to see. Case 8. Henry Lewis Wallace. Between 1990 and 1994, a Charlotte, North Carolina fast food shift manager killed 11 young black women. Most of them were his friends, co-workers, the girlfriends of his friends, the friend of his sister, the roommate of his girlfriend. He attended their visitations. He attended their funerals. He hugged their mothers. He sent sympathy cards. He used those moments to find out how close the investigation was to him and to make sure that, in front of grieving black families in a city that did not yet know it had a serial killer, he was the polite young man who had come to pay his respects. The killer's name was Henry Lewis Wallace. He had been born on the 4th of November 1965 in Barnwell, South Carolina. His mother, Lottie Mae Wallace, was a textile worker who, according to interviews Wallace later gave, was verbally abusive and physically harsh. He had been, in high school in Barnwell, on the student council and on the cheerleading squad. He had graduated in 1983. He had worked as a radio DJ. He had joined the United States Navy in 1985 and had been discharged in December of 1988 with a substance abuse diagnosis on his record. He moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in 1991, into a city that, in the early 1990s, was growing fast and was, like a lot of growing southern cities of that decade, divided along lines that the homicide unit at Charlotte Mecklenburg Police had not yet caught up with. By the early 1990s, he was a shift manager at the Taco Bell near the now demolished Eastland Mall. People who worked with him, including the people he would later kill, described him in interviews and in court testimony as charming, gentle, intelligent, and unusually well-spoken for someone in his position. He had a severe, untreated psychopathology. He had a long-running addiction to a controlled substance. By the time he was arrested, in March of 1994, he would have killed 11 young women across 4 years. He killed his first victim, Tashanda Bethea, in South Carolina, before he ever moved to Charlotte. The Charlotte killings, the cluster that would eventually give him his pattern, began in 1992 and ran for less than 2 years. Their names matter because the city of Charlotte has spent the last 3 decades insisting that they do. Tashanda Bethea was 18 years old when he killed her in Barnwell, South Carolina, in March of 1990. Sharon Nance, 33, the only victim he did not know personally, was killed in May of 1992. Caroline Love, 20, was killed in June of that year. Shauna Denise Hawk, 20, was killed on the 19th of February 1993, a college student who had worked under him at the Taco Bell. Audrey Spain, 24, was killed on the 22nd of June 1993, also a Taco Bell co-worker. Valencia Jumper, 21, a college student from Columbia, South Carolina, and a friend of Wallace's sister, was killed on the 10th of August 1993. Michelle Stinson, 20, was killed on the 14th of September 1993. Vanessa Mack. Betty Jean Balcom, 24, an assistant manager at Bojangles, was killed on the 8th of March 1994. Brandy June Henderson, 18, was killed within hours of Balcom in the same apartment complex, also on the 8th of March. Deborah Slaughter. Most of the killings followed a pattern. Wallace gained access to the victims' homes because they knew him. They opened their doors for him. They were comfortable being alone with him. He was the kind of man in their lives that nobody had any reason to fear. He had played the long game with each of them. He had cultivated their friendship and their trust over months in some cases, and years in others. They had no reason to be afraid of him. He killed by ligature. 2 of the victims he killed with a knife. Valencia Jumper's body was burned post-mortem in an effort to destroy forensic evidence, a detail that, when it was made public, shocked even the Charlotte Mecklenburg homicide investigators who were working the case at the time. Sharon Nance, the only victim he did not know personally, was beaten. The killings clustered in the apartments where his victims lived, in the corners of Charlotte that the police would later be criticised for being too slow to look at carefully. The funeral attendance is the heart of this case, and it is the part of it that, more than 3 decades later, the city of Charlotte continues to talk about. After the killing of Shauna Hawke on the 19th of February 1993, Wallace, who had been her supervisor at Taco Bell, attended her visitation. He stood among the mourners. Shauna had been 20 years old, a community college student working her way through school. She had been Dee Sumter's only daughter. The visitation was attended by family, school friends, co-workers from the Taco Bell where Shauna had worked under Wallace. He moved through the room the way a co-worker would. He spoke to people he had served shifts with. Shauna's mother, a Charlotte woman named Dee Sumter, would later tell the magazine A&E True Crime that she had run into him at a store sometime after the visitation. He had leaned over to hug her. He had told her he had been wanting to come and see her. He had told her he was so sorry. He had hugged her and patted her on the back and said that Shauna was the sweetest person ever. Dee Sumter had stood in that store and accepted the hug. She did not know what she was accepting. After the killing of Valencia Jumper on the 10th of August, 1993, Wallace and his own sister, the Friend, attended Valencia's funeral together. He personally offered her family his condolences. He sent the family a sympathy card. He was using these encounters, prosecutors would later argue at trial, for 2 reasons. The first was to gather intelligence on what the police knew and did not know. The second was to demonstrate to anyone who might be looking at him that he could not possibly be the killer. He was, in his presentation, too gentle, too well-spoken, too obviously distraught. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police, under heavy public criticism from the city's black community for the slow recognition of a serial pattern, did not arrest Wallace until the early hours of the 13th of March, 1994. The criticism was extensive and warranted. The killings had been happening by the late summer of 1993 at a rate that should have triggered a citywide pattern alert. Dee Sumter, in interviews she gave in 1995 to the Charlotte Observer, was specific about it. The deaths of young black women in her community had not been worked, in her view, with the urgency that any other set of deaths would have been worked with. The FBI, contacted before the back-to-back March 1994 killings, had declined to come in. The break came, when it finally came, from a forensic match. After the back-to-back killings of Borkham and Henderson on the 8th of March, at an apartment complex called The Lakes, the police had recovered Borkham's stolen car. Wallace's palm print was on the trunk. Detective Gary McFadden, one of only 6 or 8 homicide investigators on the Charlotte Mecklenburg force at the time, brought him in. The interrogation began that same afternoon. Wallace gave a 12-hour confession. He walked McFadden through each killing in detail, in chronological order, with the names of the victims, the dates, the addresses where the killings had taken place. He also walked him through the funerals. He walked him through who he had hugged, who he had sat with, what he had said. He spoke about the encounters with families in the language of a person who had, at the time, enjoyed them. The trial ran from September of 1996 into January of 1997 at Mecklenburg County Superior Court. It was, at the time, the largest homicide investigation in the history of North Carolina. Wallace was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder. The Barnwell and earlier South Carolina cases, which had originally been treated as separate or unsolved, were not tried in North Carolina. The jury recommended death on every count. On the 29th of January 1997, Wallace was sentenced to 9 death sentences. He was sent to Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he remains on death row. North Carolina has had a de facto moratorium on execution since 2006, the result of legal challenges to the state's lethal injection protocols. Despite some misleading headlines online suggesting otherwise, Wallace has not been executed. He has now spent more time on North Carolina's death row than the years between his first killing in 1990 and his arrest in 1994, several times over. The state has, in practical terms, decided that he will die in prison, without ever being executed under a death sentence the jury imposed twice over on every count. Dee Sumter went on to co-found Mothers of Murdered Offspring in Charlotte, an advocacy group that, 3 decades later, is still active. The organisation runs vigil events, supports families through homicide trials, and lobbies city government on policing reforms. Sumter herself has spoken openly in the years since about the hug she accepted at the store. She has said more than once that what made her go cold afterward was not the hug. It was the realization that he had asked her, in that moment, in his arms, with his hand on her back, what the police knew. He had wanted to know how close the investigation was to him. He had used a grieving mother in a North Charlotte store as an intelligence-gathering opportunity. The A&E Network's series First Blood produced a full episode on the case. The 2023 book by Ron Chepesuk, Bad Henry, The Murderous Rampage of the Taco Bell Strangler, drew heavily on Sumter's account and on McFadden's notes from the 12-hour confession he had taken on the 13th of March, 1994. The journalist Ron Chepesuk published a book about the case in 2023 called Bad Henry. The investigation produced lasting institutional reform at Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police, particularly in the staffing of the homicide unit and in the department's treatment of cases involving young black women. Detective Gary McFadden later became the Mecklenburg County Sheriff. He has spoken in detail, in lectures and in print, about the 12-hour confession Wallace gave him in March of 1994, including about the way Wallace described attending the funerals. The Eastland Mall, where Wallace had worked the Taco Bell, has been demolished. The corner where it stood has been redeveloped. The 11 women he killed remain, in Charlotte, the subject of vigils that mothers of murdered offspring still holds every year on the anniversaries of their deaths. Their photographs are placed on a memorial wall at the organisation's offices. The roll of names is read aloud. The Wallace case is about a killer who, between killings, walked into the homes of his victims' mothers and accepted their hugs. The next case is about a killer who attended his victim's funeral wearing the same jacket he had been wearing the night he killed her. The victim was 16 years old. The killer was 24. Their parents knew each other, and it would take 21 years for him to be convicted. 2 cases left in this one. If true crime breakdowns like this are what you came here for, hit subscribe. Free, fast, and it keeps the channel running. Case 9. Colin Ash Smith. In January of 1993, a 16-year-old girl was attacked at a pedestrian crossing in a quiet town in the southeast of England, while walking less than a mile to visit a friend. She had turned 16 4 days earlier. The killing went unsolved for 21 years. Within weeks of her death, the man who had attacked her stood among the mourners at her funeral, in the same beige jacket he had been wearing on the night he killed her. His parents knew her parents through the local British Legion Club. Nobody in 1993 suspected him of anything. The killer's name was Colin Ash Smith. He was 24 years old at the time of the killing. He lived in the Greenhithe and Swanscombe area of Kent, southeast of London, in the kind of small commuter town where everybody knew everybody else's parents through the local British Legion Club, the local church, the local football side. He was a former milkman. His parents, Aubrey and Diane Ash Smith, were former Labour Party councillors in the local borough. Diane Ash Smith had served as mayor of the local council. The Ash Smith family was, by the standards of Greenhithe in the early 1990s, a respectable family. Aubrey would later, in 1997, serve 12 months in prison for perverting the course of justice related to boiling and then dismantling and disposing of a knife in advance of a police search of the family home. Colin himself, by the early 1990s, was a man with no convictions but a serious internal pathology. He kept detailed written diaries describing assaults he wanted to commit. He drove a distinctive white Ford Capri. In 1988, 5 years before he killed the 16-year-old, he had attacked a 27-year-old woman in Swanscombe in an offence that included kidnap and attempted murder. That assault, undiscovered at the time, would matter later. The girl who was killed was Claire Tiltman. She was 16. She had turned 16 on the 14th of January 1993. She lived with her parents, Lynn and Cliff Tiltman, on Woodward Terrace in Horns Cross, near Dartford in Kent. She was an only child. She was a pupil at Dartford Girls' Grammar School, one of the academically selective state grammar schools that still existed in parts of England in the early 1990s, and she had earned her place there. She was studying for her GCSE examinations, the end of secondary school examinations that, in 1993, 16-year-olds across England were sitting that spring. 4 days after her 16th birthday, on a Monday evening at around 6 in the evening, she left her parents' house to walk less than a mile to visit a friend. She did not arrive. She was attacked at a pedestrian crossing in an alleyway off the London Road in Greenhithe. The injuries were inflicted with a knife. She died at the scene. The location, an alley off a main road in a quiet town on a Monday evening in mid-January, with no witnesses, was the kind of crime scene that, in the years before street corner CCTV coverage became universal in England, yielded almost nothing in the way of physical evidence. Local schoolchildren and shopkeepers were interviewed. House-to-house inquiries were carried out. Nothing led anywhere. Kent Police, working the case for the first 10 years, exhausted every line of inquiry they had. The investigation, opened immediately by Kent Police, generated thousands of statements and went nowhere. The killer, in fact, called the incident room himself on the 19th of January, the day after the attack, and told them he had driven past the crossing at about 6:30 the previous evening and had seen someone with curly hair using it. The story was a false alibi. The police took it down and put it in the file. The funeral was held within weeks of her death. The Ash Smith and Tiltman families knew each other through the local British Legion Club. Colin Ash Smith attended the funeral in a beige jacket. It was the same beige jacket, Kent Police would later confirm at trial, that he had been wearing on the night he killed her. A photograph of him at the funeral, in that jacket, among the mourners, was published by Kent Police and by ITV Meridian during the 2014 trial. He stood there in the same coat, accepted by both families, calm, composed, the son of friends of the family. He was 24 years old. He did not, that day, give any sign of what he had done. He went home. The investigation around him drifted into a cold case. It took 2 further attacks to bring him into police custody at all, and another 2 decades to bring him into court for what he had done to Claire. The investigation worked through a long list of local suspects across 1993 and 1994. Ash Smith was interviewed. He gave the same story he had given on his false alibi call. Nobody, in those interviews, could place him at the alleyway. In October of 1995, 21 months after Claire's killing, Ash Smith attacked a 21-year-old woman named Charlotte Barnard in Greenhithe with a knife. He attacked her 14 times. She survived. He was arrested within hours. A search of his white Ford Capri turned up half of a school tie that had been used in the 1988 Swanscombe attack. Across 1996 and 1997, he was convicted of those 2 offences and sentenced to life imprisonment. Kent Police at the time examined the beige jacket from the funeral. They could not, with the forensic techniques of the mid-1990s, link any fibres or DNA on it to Claire Tiltman. The fact that he had attended the funeral in the same coat, surrounded by the same families, did not surface as an investigative detail until much later. At the time, in the months after the killing, the photograph from the funeral was just another photograph. The case stayed cold for a further decade. The break finally came from inside prison. Between 2001 and 2003, at HMP Wakefield in West Yorkshire, where Ash Smith was serving his life sentence for the 2 near-fatal attacks of 1988 and 1995, he began to talk about Claire Tiltman to a fellow inmate named Stéphane Dubois. Dubois was himself a convicted offender. He was held in the same prison wing. Over a period of more than a year, Ash Smith confided in him about the Tiltman killing, in language that came across as a kind of boast. He told him, on more than one occasion, that he had snapped and attacked a young girl at a zebra crossing. The detail mattered. The 1988 Swanscombe attack and the 1995 Greenhithe attack had taken place away from any pedestrian crossings. Only Claire Tiltman's killing had happened at a crossing. The Criminal Justice Act of 2003, which by then had come into force, permitted what English law calls bad character evidence to be put before juries. That change meant that, for the first time, a jury could be told about Ash Smith's earlier near-fatal attacks and about his assault diaries. In September of 2013, the Kent Police cold case team searched his parents' addresses again. They found, kept in the family home, a newspaper cutting marking the first anniversary of Claire's killing. He had kept it as a trophy for 2 decades. On the 12th of February 2014, the Crown Prosecution Service charged him with Claire Tiltman's murder. The trial opened later that year at Inner London Crown Court at Southwark, before Mr. Justice Sweeney. The prosecution was led by Brian Altman, QC, one of the most senior Treasury counsel in England at the time. The case the prosecution put together was almost entirely circumstantial. It rested on three things: the prison confession to Stéphane Dubois, the false alibi phone call made by Ash Smith on the 19th of January 1993, the day after the killing, the pattern of his prior near-fatal attacks on women, evidence of which was now admissible under the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. The trial ran for 5 weeks. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for 3.5 hours. On the 11th of December 2014, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. The verdict was unanimous. The jury had taken 3.5 hours to return it after a 5-week trial. Mr. Justice Sweeney imposed life imprisonment with a minimum tariff calibrated under 1993 sentencing law. He noted in his published sentencing remarks that under post-2003 law, the minimum tariff he could have imposed would have been 30 years. Ash Smith refused to be present in the dock for the sentencing and the victim impact statements. He has remained in custody since. In May of 2016, after the death of his father Aubrey, he applied for a special purpose licence to attend the funeral. The Ministry of Justice denied the application after a public outcry from the Tiltman family campaign and from Kent residents. The decision was upheld in subsequent reviews. He remains incarcerated in a high-security English prison and is not expected to be released. Lynn and Cliff Tiltman both died before the conviction. They had spent 21 years not knowing who had killed their daughter. Both parents had spent the 21 years between the conviction and the conviction working with Kent Police, writing to the Home Office, and giving interviews to local and national press. They had become, in Kent, a familiar pair, the Tiltmans, the parents of the schoolgirl who had been killed in the alleyway in 1993. Lynn, in interviews she had given to the Kent press in the years before her death, had spoken with a precision and a restraint that the British press of that era was not always good at carrying. She had said more than once that what she wanted was a name. She had not lived to hear it. Cliff died not long after her. A community campaign called Justice for Claire, made up of her old school friends Joanne Roberts, Vicky Atkins, Lisa Gribbin and others, who had been 16 years old with Claire and were now in their late 30s, attended every day of the trial in Southwark in 2014. In April of 2016, Dartford Borough Council renamed a street in Greenhithe, Tiltman Avenue, the road previously known as Fast Track Manor Way. A community facility in Cotton Lane, Stone, carries her name as the Claire Tiltman Centre. Her school friends continue, in their 40s now, to mark her birthday each January, the way they would have if she had stayed alive. They had been her friends for not very long. They were children for not very long with her. They have had to be adults without her for almost the entire span of their adult lives. The Ash Smith case is about a quiet British town where the killer and the victim's parents were friends. The last case is about a quiet Australian farming district, an 89-year-old World War II veteran one day shy of his 90th birthday, and a killer who had known the veteran's family for more than a decade before he sent another man into the old man's bedroom to kill him. Case 10. Adam Williamson. In September of 2015, a 40-year-old man in rural Victoria, Australia, manipulated a friend into killing an 89-year-old World War II veteran inside the veteran's own bedroom. The veteran was one day shy of his 90th birthday. The killer had known the old man's family personally for more than a decade. The old man's grandson, when he gave his testimony at the sentencing hearing 2.5 years later, would say that the fact this man had known his grandfather, by name, filled him with a rage he could not contain. In the days after the killing, the killer was reported among the mourners at the funeral, and he approached the old man's granddaughter face to face. The man who organised the killing was Adam Lucas Williamson. He was 40 years old. He lived in the Ballarat and Springbank district of Victoria, in central Victoria, a rural part of the state about an hour and a half northwest of Melbourne. The district is farmland and small towns, the kind of place where everybody in a 5-kilometre radius knows everybody else by sight. He had known the family of the man he would kill for more than a decade. The old man's grandson had been an acquaintance of his for years. Williamson, by the accounts that emerged at his sentencing hearing, had developed a grudge against the old man and had become convinced he kept large amounts of cash hidden inside the farmhouse. He persuaded another man, a 29-year-old named Jonathan Jeffrey Cooper, to join him in a planned home invasion. He persuaded Cooper to come along by falsely telling Cooper that the old man was a danger to children. Cooper had been hurt as a child, and the false claim worked on him. Williamson's sentencing judge, Justice Jane Dixon of the Supreme Court of Victoria, would later describe Williamson as the driving force behind the killing and as the instigator. The man they killed was Kenneth Handford. He was 89 years old. He lived alone on Bungaree Barkstead Road in Springbank, Victoria, on land he had worked for decades. He was a World War II veteran with the Royal Australian Air Force with service in New Guinea. He had formally retired in 1980, but had continued to work as a farmhand into his late 80s. He was, by every account that survives him in the local Ballarat newspaper The Courier, a true Australian battler. His neighbours described him as tough, generous, and quietly proud of his service. He had checked on his neighbours' homes during local sporting events as a matter of habit. He had 5 grandchildren, including 2 granddaughters named Leah Handford and Courtney Pearce. He had 3 great-grandchildren. The local Ballarat newspaper The Courier had run features on him over the years for his service. He was, in his small district of central Victoria, the kind of older man who was a fixture, who had been there when nobody else was, who had checked on his neighbours' homes during the local Australian Football League Grand Final, because he had been concerned about empty houses during community-wide events. The home invasion happened in the early hours of the 14th of September 2015. The day before, on Sunday the 13th of September, the 2 men had been overheard by witnesses planning the home invasion. They had believed Kenneth Handford had approximately $20,000 in cash hidden in his bedroom. Williamson and Cooper kicked in the back door of Kenneth Handford's house. Cooper, the one Williamson had recruited and lied to, attacked the old man as he woke. He hit him in the head with a torch. He hit him again on the hand when the old man reached for the phone to call for help. He attacked him 13 times in the back with a knife. The 2 men tied the old man, gagged him, and left him on the floor of his bedroom. They took his World War II medals, his jewellery, a gold chain, his mobile phone, and $3,900 Australian dollars in cash. Then they left. Kenneth Handford's pacemaker, recovered later from his body, recorded the rest. He lay on his bedroom floor alive for 4 hours and 38 minutes before he died. He was found the next day, on the 15th of September, the day that would have been his 90th birthday, by neighbours who came to check on him because something seemed wrong. Victoria Police, arriving at the scene, found him bound. His hands were tied with the cord from his own dressing gown. His legs were tied to the bed. He had been gagged with a sock. The neighbours, who had known him for decades, were unable, in the days afterward, to put into words what they had seen when they walked through the back door of the house and into the bedroom. The funeral was held in the days that followed. By the accounts that have been compiled in later true crime retellings of the case, Williamson was reported among the mourners. He was reported to have approached Kenneth Handford's granddaughter to speak with her face to face. The funeral attendance is not, it has to be said, the most heavily sourced moment in this story. The primary Australian court reporting from the Ballarat-based newspaper The Courier, which covered the case in detail from arrest through appeal, did not lead with this detail. What that reporting did establish, definitively, was the underlying fact that makes the funeral attendance painful in either case. Williamson had known the Handford family for more than 10 years before he organised the killing. He was not a stranger to them. He could walk into the room. Cooper broke first. He told a friend within days of the killing what he and Williamson had done. He showed her the knife. He showed her the clothes. He told her, by her later testimony, that Handford had spoken to him during the attack. He had said, Cooper told the friend, "Please stop, you are killing me." Cooper, who had been told the old man was a danger to children, had registered in that moment that what he had been told was probably not true. Victoria Police, following an unrelated phone intercept on a separate target, overheard Cooper, an associate, and Williamson discussing the police media release about the killing and the car that had been used. Williamson, in another monitored call from a woman's vehicle, asked her how DNA transferred between people and whether she would tell the police he had been with her all weekend. Both men were arrested. Both men, at the committal hearing in Ballarat Magistrates Court, initially pleaded not guilty. Both men, at the committal hearing held over 2 days at Ballarat Magistrates Court, in front of a regional magistrate, initially pleaded not guilty to murder. The committal nevertheless found there was sufficient evidence to send the case to the Supreme Court of Victoria for trial. In April of 2017, Cooper pleaded guilty to murder. The Supreme Court of Victoria sentenced him to 16 years with a non-parole period of 13. The Handford family was devastated. Leah Handford and Courtney Pearce, the two granddaughters, gathered 30,000 signatures on a petition asking the Victorian Attorney General to review the sentence. The Director of Public Prosecutions appealed it. Later in 2017, the Court of Appeal of Victoria, in a judgment delivered by Justices Weinberg, Priest and Beach, called the original sentence wholly outside the range, called the murder one at the high end of the spectrum of seriousness, and resentenced Cooper to 24 years with a non-parole period of 20. Williamson, having initially pleaded guilty to lesser charges and then rescinded that plea, re-entered his plea on the 10th of October 2017 in front of Justice Jane Dixon. Williamson was then sentenced in April of 2018 after his own change of plea by Justice Jane Dixon. He had pleaded guilty to unintentional killing in the course of a crime of violence, to aggravated burglary and to theft. Justice Dixon sentenced him to 27 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 23. The sentence was, at the time, one of the longer sentences imposed for a non-murder homicide conviction in Victorian state law that year. Williamson appealed against the severity of his sentence. The Court of Appeal of Victoria, in a judgment delivered later in 2018 by Justice Simon Whelan and two other appellate judges, dismissed the appeal. The court found that the sentencing court had properly weighed the gravity of the offence, the 4-hour 38-minute survival window the pacemaker had recorded, and Williamson's role as the instigator. Both men remain in Victorian prisons. They will not be eligible for release for 2 more decades. The Handford family, in the years since, has continued to speak publicly each anniversary, year on year, in the same regional Victorian paper that covered the original investigation. They have done so on the same date each September, alongside photographs of Kenneth in younger years. In September of 2025, the Courier ran a 10-year anniversary feature on the killing, with new interviews from Ron Handford, Kenneth's surviving brother, and from his granddaughters Leah and Courtney. The article carried photographs of Kenneth in his Royal Australian Air Force uniform from the 1940s, and photographs of the house on Bungaree Barkstead Road, which has been preserved by the family. Leah Handford, the granddaughter, has continued to speak publicly. She has said in interviews that the worst part of what happened, beyond her grandfather's death itself, and beyond the 4 hours and 38 minutes he spent on his bedroom floor before he died, was the fact that her family had been close enough to Adam Williamson for long enough that they would have recognised him on sight. They had not been protected by the kind of distance that, in most home invasions, separates the killer from the victim. They had known him. Whether the funeral attendants reported in some later true crime retellings of the case can be confirmed in Australian primary sources is, by the family's own account, almost beside the point now. What the family lived with was the fact that Williamson had been an acquaintance of Kenneth Handford's grandson for more than 10 years. He had been in their orbit. He had been someone they would have nodded to in the street. The thing that had been taken from them when Kenneth Handford lay on his bedroom floor for 4 hours and 38 minutes had not been only an old man. It had been the assumption of safety inside their own local community. They have not, in any of those interviews, forgiven Williamson. The 30,000 signature petition the family ran in 2017 set a precedent in regional Victoria for community-driven sentencing reviews. The killing itself remains, for that part of central Victoria, one of the worst home invasions in living memory. 10 cases, 10 killers, 10 funerals or memorials or wakes or vigils at which the people who had done the killing chose to stand among the people who had been left behind and pretend, for an afternoon, that they belonged there. If you want the next investigation to find you when it lands, hit subscribe. We will see you on the next case.